In honor of the 85th anniversary of the Worldcon Masquerade, Bash the Pinata will dance through 85 years of filk music.
Time religion, give me that old time religion, give me that old time religion. It's good enough for me. Science fiction is his hobby.
To that Worldcon that's up in the sky, we'll have a last bash.
And that is called bashing the Balrog.
You bash the Balrog, you bash the Balrog.
And we're banned from Morojo, everyone.
Suit up and it'll make you feel better. Suit up and it'll make it alright.
Isn't it great to be different? At the con, okay, we're gonna like. Meet me at the con.
Alright, so that was the intro for last year's panel. Last year's panel was celebrating 85 years of convention history from the first 3-day convention, which took place July 4th weekend in New York City till today. And actually, I want to thank you all if you went to the panel last year at Anthrocon. It actually was nominated and won the Ursa Major Award for Best Nonfiction piece. So this year I decided to do a new version of this panel. So as opposed to celebrating 85 years of cons, because that's a lot to talk about. I had an hour and a half last year and I still couldn't fit everything. I'm going to focus on one specific portion of the convention scene, and that is costumes, cosplay, and fursuiting. And it's also another 85-year anniversary because it's the 85th year since the first cosplay lounge. So I think that's a good place to get started. So welcome to Con History, from Costume Masquerade to Fursuit Parade. So this is an interesting panel because I did not actually seek out to do a history of cosplay. In fact, this isn't a history of cosplay. In fact, a lot of the stuff I actually had to put together very last minute based off of my previous research. There are a few panels, I think there's a few videos out there and even academic articles that go more in depth on the history of cosplay than I will go on, but the ones I checked out seem to leave a lot out. And I noticed a little bits and stuff just doing the history of conventions. I have to end up looking at the evolution of costuming at cons. So I decided to just do this panel that cuts out all the other topics I talk about and just focus on costuming. So I'm not saying it's a history of costuming and cosplay, and it's not a lead up to the modern day, but I want to focus on specific movements I have noticed, specific individuals who probably paved the way to where we are today. So while this is a panel that we're doing at a FurryCon, it's not going to focus 100% on furry, but we will focus a little bit towards the end on the formation of the FurryCons, the Fursuit Lounge, Fursuits, and the Fursuit Parade. But let's get started with the group that I'm involved with, Con History. You can message us on conhistory.com if you have any questions or want to send in photos, information. If you want to send in some of your own experiences, just email me at conhistory@gmail.com. This is the family tree I produced last year that kind of tracks all these different types of cons, from the multimedia cons, comic cons, anime cons, and of course furry cons, all extending from these early science fiction cons that started in the 1930s. There is a full version of this in the art show, if you had a chance to check that out. But we're going to see how, especially how costuming at these early science fiction cons ended up inspiring all the different costume, cosplay, and fursuit movements that we have when we get to the modern convention scene. If you want to know more about con history, I'm working on a webcomic that I'm hoping will be released soon. The webcomic is divided into specific eras, and it's going to focus on the formation of the very first Worldcon and early science fiction cons, and eventually lead on to the formation of other conventions. So it's a kind of a historical webcomic where I take real life figures, draw them as anthropomorphic animals, and retell the story of the early fandom. Panel is also dedicated to Mark Marleno, also known as Sai, who is considered one of the founders of the furry fandom. He unfortunately passed away last year. I had the privilege of him popping into one of my panels at a con, and I invited him on the stage and let him talk for like an hour, and it was fantastic. Some of the information I have on the furry cons came from him as well. So just want to dedicate this to Mark. So let's get started, because depending on who covers cosplay history, they sometimes like to start in this pre-con period. Since the history of costuming is very, very in-depth, I don't think we need to discuss this at all, but I do want to show some examples of pre-convention science fiction costumes and what we could call retroactively fursuits for those who are interested. This could even be as an entire panel or research paper on its own, but this is not going to be part of this panel. But for anyone who's interested, there's a lot of interesting pre-convention costuming out there. Where we have to get started is where I started with last year's panel, and that is, of course, at Worldcon. Worldcon was the first 3-day convention that kind of started the ball rolling. While if you talk to any science fiction fan, they might like to claim PhilCon or Leeds or the first National Science Fiction Convention were considered the first con. However, every single convention that we have now, from the Comic Cons, Furry Cons, and Anime Cons, could be tracked to this very, very first Worldcon. Worldcon was the first con to have the first organized programming, the first con book, the first Dead Dog party. There was a lot of firsts. The first line for the convention, so you know, con lines have always been a thing. But most importantly, it was the first cosplay, and this is where we have to introduce Forrest J. Ackerman. No dot at the end of the J, as he liked it. Forrest J. Ackerman is known as the first fandom personality. So nowadays, if you're involved with the furry fandom, you have the concept of having someone who is popular. This was essentially what Forrest J. Ackerman was. He was involved in the science fiction fandom as young as when he was 12. He spent time writing fan letters to people. The formation of what we call organized fandom kind of came about by accident. Hugo Gernsback, when he was publishing his science fiction magazines, he would also publish letters complete with the full names and addresses of people writing him letters in the back of his magazine, which had the unintentional consequence of having all these fans write to the people who wrote letters, and eventually started basically the first kind of social media in this early days where fans are writing back and forth from each other. A 12-year-old Forrest J. Ackerman became one of the big fan personalities of this time period. He was very big into Esperanto and liked to shorten his name, including as Fori, as we will refer him to. He actually won the Hugo Award for being the first fan personality at the first Hugo Award. He represented many authors as a literary agent. He was the first person to publish a young Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, and also created the magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland. It's arguable that the magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland is what basically started the horror fandom and preserved the Universal style monster genre to the modern day. He also co-created the character Vampirella. Was also one of the first guests of honor for San Diego Comic-Con. So he was a very big fan personality for his period. But what he was known for was basically coining a lot of terms. He would shorten a lot of terms together. In fact, the term pen name and sci-fi came from Forrest J. Ackerman. We still use these terms to this day. And what he called cosplay back then, he actually used the very wordy futuristic costumes. So this is what he called cosplay during this period. As a big fan personality, he also attracted a lot of fans. One of the individuals who was a big fan of his was actually a fangirl who was a decade older than him, who went by the Esperanto name Morojo, and she was convinced to help make him a costume based off the H.G. Wells movies Things to Come, which we see here. And he wore this costume around the streets of New York. So he was involved with LOSFIS, which was the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society back during this period. And he came all the way from Los Angeles to New York City for the very first Worldcon. So when he arrived in New York for Worldcon, I guess a bunch of the Futurians greeted him as he got off the bus. And one of the Futurians, a short, little 15-year-old kid who had a cigarette in his mouth named Cyril Kornbluth, who you might recognize later as a science fiction author, went up to Forrest J. Ackerman and said, "Are you that Forrest J. Ackerman who's writing all these letters?" And Forrest was like, "Yes." And Cyril punched him in the stomach, so that was his welcome to New York City. Now, Forrest J. Ackerman, even though he was a big fan personality, he was writing to all the fanzines and science magazines, he was actually shy and socially awkward in real life. So they were wanting him to give speeches at Worldcon, and he was just very, very introverted. In fact, they asked him to give an impromptu speech at Worldcon, and just the thought of giving a speech gave him a headache. Luckily, the wife of John Campbell gave him an aspirin, so he was finally able to go on stage and give his speech. Now, even though he was socially awkward, in modern terms, he might be neurodivergent, because he was so excited to wear his cosplay that he wore the entire con and would wear it when they were going out in New York, on the streets of New York, even wearing it to the World's Fair. So this, as the first cosplayer, he was wearing a costume before the concept of a cosplay lounge existed, so he couldn't really change if he wanted to. So once he put on his costume, he was stuck wearing that costume the entire day. However, he was saying wearing the costume felt like being Superman, and he had a complete personality change when he put on his costume. Luckily enough, he was friends with the creator of Superman, so you could probably tell him this story as well. But so he and a bunch of the Worldcon attendees went to the World's Fair, and at the World's Fair there was a stage where people from different countries could go up and speak in their own native language. Forrest J. Ackerman took this opportunity to go on stage and speak in Esperanto, and then in Esperanto basically said, "I'm a time traveler from the future." So that's where you get a lot of fun Forrest J. Ackerman stuff. So as like I said, he was a co-creator of Vampirilla and Famous Monsters of Filmland. He was also given the title Honorary Lesbian because he wrote articles for that first lesbian fanzine as well. So here is Ackerman at Caravan Hall. Caravan Hall was the location of that first Worldcon. I actually found these photos recently. These are photos of the cosplay. Apparently they were up for auction at some point in time. I have no idea what happened to them, but you can see that these are actually colorized versions of his cosplay. And actually, if you actually look in the, this is the furry version of Forrest J. Ackerman that I drew in the book. So I guess Furry J. Ackerman, if you want to say, wearing that cosplay. So this is Morojo who cosplayed with him. That's the thing, a lot of people forget that Morojo also, while she wasn't the first cosplayer, she did cosplay at that first Worldcon as well, so she's the second cosplayer, but she did make their costume, so she is the first costume maker, and they have both properly been honored as the first cosplayer, the mothers and fathers of cosplays down this time. What's interesting is Morojo was like 12 years older than Forrest J. Ackerman, so it's like weird because she was 12 years older, yet she was a fangirl of this young 20-year-old kid who was a big fan personality. I guess they had a falling out later on. So whenever you look at the history of cosplay, people will either cite Forrest J. Ackerman as the original cosplayer without really mentioning Morojo, or some people who feel like Morojo got the short staff would talk all about her being the first cosplay maker and also one of the first cosplayers and downplay Forrest J. Ackerman. I think it's important to note that both these individuals had an equally important role in cosplaying at the first Worldcon. So let's talk a little bit about Meryl Douglas, who took the Esperanto name Morojo. They were both involved with the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society, which was a spin-off from the Science Fiction League. They published one of the earliest zines, which was Imagination, which was also the first magazine to publish a work from a 17-year-old Ray Bradbury. So Ray Bradbury's first story was published by the zine created by Ackerman and Morojo. In fact, when Bradbury wanted to go to Worldcon all the way in New York City, they lent him money to pay for a Greyhound bus to go all the way from Los Angeles to New York City. Morojo had a bigger role in the Worldcon that happened in Chicago the following year. She's also nicknamed Chicon. At Chicon, a lot of people who saw these two in cosplay the year before wanted to dress up the next year. And since there was a lot of people who now needed a changing room, she offered her con room, room 689, for cosplayers to change. And most science fiction historians consider this the first con suite, and also retroactively the first cosplay lounge. And given that the Headless lounge that we have at FurryCons come from the cosplay lounge, we could also credit her for that as well. The con suite at most cons now become the hospitality suite. Some furry cons that were founded by science fiction fans in the 90s still keep the hospitality suite, but we have her to thank for that. Now, at this second Worldcon in Chicago, we have a group. Now we have Morojo and Ackerman dressed in their outfits doing a skit. So kind of the precursor to the masquerade skits. But what was more interesting is after they all got changed in their costumes and started wandering the streets of Chicago, Ackerman passed by a newspaper office, and they decided to go to the newspaper office, and Ackerman basically said, "We are time travelers from the future, and you're going to put us in you're going to take a photo of us and put us in the paper the next day." So like, okay, so they took a photo of them, but they never ended up publishing it. But that's kind of funny, Ackerman's kind of personality. But basically what they had, this is the first important tradition, is they decided to have a Saturday night masquerade. Now the term masquerade specifically was for a costume party, but that term will eventually be used specifically within the convention scene for also a stage show where cosplayers will come on stage and do a little skit. But this is where it started in Chicago exactly 85 years ago. With that masquerade was also the first costume contest, and David A. Kyle dressed as Ming the Merciless won. If you listened to my con history panel last year, you remember David A. Kyle was the troublemaker who published a yellow pamphlet that got his friends banned from the con. But yes, he was the person who won the cosplay during that time period. So from this early period, you start seeing the evolution of costumings at these early science fiction cons. So costuming would evolve at the science fiction cons over the next few decades, and David A. Kyle would pop up again and try to use costuming as a means to market his conventions. So he ended up marrying the model Louis Miles. So he would use his model wife to promote his bid for Worldcon and would market her as Miss Science Fiction. So unfortunately, even with all his attempts to use his wife as Miss Science Fiction, he actually lost that bid for that 1950 Worldcon, which ended up being won by Portland, known as NorwestCon. And NorwestCon was actually the first documented stage masquerade. It's also where the first Dianetic session took place by Undercover as well, which is kind of funny as well. one of the more important movements went from the masquerade as kind of a costume party to the masquerade being a stage event where you would dress in costumes and perform a little skit. 1950 Worldcon in Portland, also known as Norwestcon. So unfortunately, New York lost the bid. And if you don't know how Worldcon functions, Worldcon is not a con that's held in any stationary city. It changes city every year, and normally the cities that want to host the Worldcon will host a room party on the party floor. Normally, if you could host a good room party, that means you could host a good con, and the bids were normally done on the party floor. So the best room party normally would end up the host of the best room party would normally be the con for the following Worldcon. We don't have much documentations from these early masquerades, so these are some of the photos I found online. But this is where we start getting the rise of costume personalities, and one of the first important individuals I want to mention is Olga Ley. Olga Ley married a science fiction writer and helped illustrate for his book Exotic Zoology. At the 1954 Worldcon, she won the Most Beautiful Costume Award at the Masquerade, dressed as Deep Space. So this is her outfit here. And some fan historians like Michael Resnick call her the first great costumer. So a lot of people also see her as one of the first cosplay personalities retroactively. So here's a photo of Olga Ley at the next year's Worldcon, and I want to point out this individual right here, Karen Anderson, because she's also going to emerge as an important cosplay personality, especially during the 1950s. So here's a colorized outfit of Olga Ley. So the other individual that was in that photo was Karen Anderson. Karen Anderson also married a science fiction writer and coordinated with stories. Interesting enough, she was the first person to spot the typo for science fiction folk music misspelled as filk. Karen Anderson was actually the very first to spot a typo in the con book. So a lot of cons would have fan music during this period printed in the con book where people would sing different songs. And these songs back then were called science fiction folk music. However, they accidentally mistyped folk as filk. And Karen Anderson decided filk should be the term for fan music and thus wrote the first filk song afterwards. That is actually why the term filk is now used to apply to different fan music. So for example, Homestuck fan music is called Homestuck filk. And it's arguable that brony music should also be called brony folk as well. So she was also the one that was bouncing the potatoes off her plates at the banquet, and thus the folk song Bouncing Potatoes was formed. But most famously is she would cosplay with her daughter, Astrid. In fact, what was funny was when I was doing my exhibit at the Chicago Worldcon, an older woman came up to me and said, "Oh, that's my mother right there." And I was like, "Oh, that means you're Astrid then." So it's interesting to have this mother-daughter appear cosplaying at a lot of these different cons, and together they came up with a lot of unique cosplay innovations. So together they cosplayed as a vampire and a bite victim, and they made use of gelatin for blood, which was a big innovation for cosplay during this time period, the idea of having blood being done with gelatin, and they won the costume contest that year for that. The next important couple is going to be Dick and Pat, who were the editors of the fanzine Zero. It is highly believed that this fanzine is what basically started the modern comic book fandom. Published in 1963, it won the Hugo Award for the best fanzine. So to promote their fanzine, they actually dressed up as Captain Marvel and Mary Marvel at Worldcon in 1960. Some of the earliest superhero cosplays. And you have to remember, during this period, the superhero fandom, the comic book fandom, was also a subset of science fiction. So for at least the first 40 years of convention, science fiction was a catch-all term for all pop culture. So up until the 60s, if anyone ever refers to science fiction, that also include comics, cartoons, fantasy, gaming, horror, Even the earliest anthropomorphic fandom that would evolve to the furry fandom would be classified as science fiction. The next major change came with the Star Trek conventions. And the Star Trek conventions started mostly by female fans, while the previous era of science fiction cons were heavily male dominated. It was this next movement with the Star Trek cons where we saw a rise of female leaders, fan leaders, and con chairs. One of the most important members is B-Row Trimble. Like Ackerman and Morojo, she was also a member of Losfus. B-Row also used the Esperanto name, inspired by both Ackerman and Morojo. If you're involved in the furry and anime community, you also know the two founding fathers of both the furry and anime fandoms, Fred Patent and Mark Merlino, were also members of Losfus, along with Ray Bradbury, Robert A. Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard. So this is a fan club that basically had a big influence on modern fandom. B-Row was important because she started the Save Star Trek campaign. The Save Star Trek campaign is what got Star Trek, the original series, its third season. In the convention scene, she's also very important because she's the one who started the art show. So if you went to the Anthrocon art show, you have her to thank for that. Now, the first Star Trek convention had over 3,000 attendees, and they started to boom in attendance. Very, very high numbers. But what made Star Trek Con stand out from the previous science fiction cons is Star Trek was based off a televised franchise that had visual representation for how the outfits look. So now you had costume makers who are trying to replicate an official standard for what the costume should look like. So now you have the rise of show-accurate cosplay, which was something that really didn't exist much in the previous period. Though Ackerman's and Morojo's cosplay were based off the movie Things to Come, most science fiction novels didn't have cover art for a lot of the characters. So a lot of the costumes were made up based on someone's imagination. This is really the next movement where the shift in con costuming would go based on show-accurate representation. Here is one of the Star Trek costumers. This is in the mid-70s, and we'll notice this individual down here, also another female costumer, Fern. She was a filker and zine publisher, and she wore a cosplay which I could argue was probably one of the early proto-fursuits. She dressed based on, it was Spock's pet in the animated Star Trek series that she cosplayed at. Made this outfit herself. She said she wore it to a Halloween event on campus and terrified her department head. But interesting that when you look at the history of furry costuming and fursuits, you actually don't see her mentioned. But I could argue she might have an influence because a lot of the early furries were also Star Trek fans and Trekkies. The next individual I want to mention is Scott Shaw, one of the co-founders of San Diego Comic-Con. So aside from Ken Kruger and Cheryl Dorff, one of the other individuals who's responsible for founding San Diego Comic-Con is Scott Shaw. Scott Shaw, he made a character for a zine that was published by Ken Kruger. Ken Kruger was actually the youngest attendee at the very first Worldcon at the age of 13. Ken Kruger published his own comic anthology and ran a comic shop in San Diego, and Scott Shaw published a story called The Turd for Ken Kruger's zine. And so he decided to cosplay at Worldcon dressed up as his turd character, where he would wear a bathing suit and a stocking over his head and slather himself up with crunchy peanut butter. And unfortunately, the peanut butter got really rancid fast and would drip off under the hot convention lights. And even with these circumstances, he decided to enter the cosplay contest, and they created a new category for him, winning the most revolting costume. Now, after this, he had to take a shower to wash all this stuff off, And the hotel maid actually came in and he tried to explain what was happening. And she actually said, you know, I've seen worse. However, a week later, the con staff got a call from the hotel saying, our drains are clogged and they're filled with peanut butter. And legend goes that the con staff was responsible for billed thousands of dollars for hotel repairs to fix these pipes. And because of this, the official Rule 7 for costume contests, in fact, this is the rules that were codified for these early science fiction costume contests are now used for every single comic and anime convention costuming rule. Rule 7 states, parts of your costume should not be edible or smell, it should not fall off accidentally, be brushed off against other contestants, or left lying on the stage. And this rule was added because of Scott Shaw. Now, a lot of people say that this was a myth, that the con didn't have to pay for the repairs, but that's how the story went in the early science fiction comics fandom for a long time, that the con was stuck with the bill. In a view from the modern anime scene, we'll probably see a similarity with the story with the Homestuck Sharpie bath situation. So basically what the Homestuck Sharpie bath was to us modern con goers has been going on since the early convention scene as well with the turd. So the term cosplay actually is a Japanese term, and a lot of purists will always say true cosplay has to be based off anime. But if we look at the woman who's considered the first Japanese cosplayer, she actually didn't even dress up as an anime character. So Morojo actually dressed up at one of these science fiction cons in Japan. This is an important science fiction con because it was heavily modeled off of Worldcon and actually gave rise to Comic-Con, which eventually became the largest convention in the world and influenced the United States anime cons. In fact, the Artist Alley came from Comic-Con. But these early cons in Japan were heavily influenced by science fiction. She dressed up as a character from Edgar Rice Burroughs' Fighting a Man from Mars, and was hanging around the anime screening rooms. So back then, anime was shown in screening rooms at conventions. That was the only place where you had access. Even in Japan, anime was not considered a big focal point of the con. But when people who were at the anime screening room saw her dressing up as Edgar Rice's Burroughs character, they actually thought she was cosplaying as Tezuka's Triton of the Sea. In fact, here's Tezuka's character, and here's the character from the Edgar Rice Burroughs stories she was actually cosplaying. So you can understand why a lot of people confused her for cosplaying as an anime character. So even though she was not actually cosplaying as an anime character, she inspired a lot of attendees at the con to dress as anime and manga characters the following year. So she is considered the first Japanese cosplayer for inspiring that movement, even though she wasn't dressed up as an anime character to begin with. In America, however, Karen Dick is often cited as the first non-Japanese cosplayer to dress as an anime character. She cosplayed at San Diego Comic-Con as Captain Hardlock. This is her cosplay here, and this is another variation of her cosplay. So she was the one that really got the ball rolling, cosplaying as characters from Japan. Karen Dick eventually helped create a convention based around costuming called Costume Con, and eventually she helped create the Fantasy Costumers Guild. Eventually became reorganized as the International Costumers Guild, and the International Costumers Guild is still the largest cosplay organization in the world. She was honored with a lifetime achievement for her early work in organizing cosplay at these conventions and for her cosplay. The International Costumers Guild eventually also honored Forrest J. Ackerman as the father of cosplay at Worldcon in 1994, and rightfully so, Morojo was eventually honored as the mother of convention costuming in 2016. So I've been using the term costuming and cosplay kind of interchangeably, and it's because it came from this period. So even though the term cosplay has not been coined yet, what the term cosplay referred to was specifically science fiction costuming. So Japan already had a word during this period for people who dressed up, but the term cosplay actually came from one Japanese attendee at Worldcon who was very impressed with the science fiction costumes at the masquerades, specifically the costumes of the Trekkies. Because like I was saying, the Trekkies were doing show accurate costuming. So he wrote an article for the magazine My Anime and originally tried to have trouble translating the word masquerade, because the term masquerade in Japan referred to upper class costume balls, and it didn't accurately represent people just getting into costumes and acting out the role. So eventually he called it costume play before they decided to rename the article as a play of that word as cosplay, and that's where the term cosplay was formed. Now, if you look at videos of people who want to do the history of cosplay, you also have a lot of cosplay purists who say true cosplay, the only things that could use the term cosplay are Japanese anime and Japanese manga costuming, when in reality the term cosplay was specifically referring to science fiction costumes, specifically Trekkies. So it could be fair to argue that the umbrella of what the term cosplay should cover is what he originally meant for it to cover. So basically, if we extend the term cosplay to Trekkies, as he originally intended, that's where the term cosplay should go. But this is the period in the 80s when the term cosplay was finally used. So, during this period, we started to now have more personalities who like to cosplay, specifically in Japan. So we have this individual who was a future manga artist who loved to model in bikinis, and she would cosplay as Loom, this character right here, and she would often be a guest at the early American anime cons. And if you went to my panel last year, you'll find it interesting that both the furry convention and anime convention basically had the same parents, both the Cartoon Fantasy Organization and BayCon. So it's interesting to see anime cons, the sibling twin of furry cons, go down this unique route. So she was invited from Japan as one of the early guest of honors, becoming one of the, not only one of the most well-known manga artists, but one of the most well-known cosplayers in America, especially during the 1990s. Here's her on the cover of the Capsucon con book, and her wandering around one of the early American anime cons. And what's interesting is actually, originally, I thought the anime cons in America were inspired by Japanese cons, because obviously anime is a Japanese invention. But what's actually interesting is the anime cons in America came from the group, the Cartoon Fantasy Organization, that also created the furry cons, and actually the American style of anime cons went back to Japan and inspired how they would run cons. In fact, most anime cons in Japan now are called American style convention, because they are so vastly different from what Comic-Con is, which is more their standard for what a convention is. And Comic-Con would be the equivalent of a small press convention here in the United States, though Comic-Con is the largest convention, 3 times larger than San Diego Comic-Con. So now that we talked about anime cons, we have to look at their sibling, the furry cons, and thus the furry fandom. And I want to introduce this individual, Robert Hill, one of the first important individuals within the furry scenes in terms of costuming. He was involved with a furry zine called Morojo, and he also worked as a character performer at Disney. And in fact, he designed some of the earliest fursuits in the furry fandom before the term fursuit was even coined. So here's a picture of him in one of his panda outfits, and here's him as a character performer at Disneyland. He's dressed as Eeyore in the middle right here. So you could see where a lot of early furry costumes took more inspiration from sports mascots. But with Robert Hill, he took more inspiration from the character performing suits of theme parks like Disney. One of his most famous suits, and I think a lot of people associate with being considered one of the first true fursuits, is Hilda the Bamboid, which was based off I believe it was based off, Jerry Collins' character. They were a race of humanoid deer aliens. and he designed an outfit based off that character, Hilda the Bamboid. And we could see from the very first convention, Conference Zero, which took place in 1989, and modern interpretations of that outfit before he passed away. So this leads us to the term fursuit. Just like the term cosplay was coined, the term fursuit was coined after the first few fursuits were made. In fact, most of these Anthro mascot costume suits were originally called zoots. So a fursuiter was called a fursuiter, and fursuiting was called zooting during this period. So the term fursuit was actually eventually coined by, funny enough, the founder of Midwest Furfest, Robert King, who was the one who started that furry track at DuckCon. Like I said, that furry track would outgrow DuckCon and become Midwest Furfest as we know it. He would create a mailing list called the Fursuit mailing list. Fursuit was actually a reference to Fursuit, so that's where we get the term fursuit from, and this is where we believe this is the first coined term. This is the first instance where the term fursuit was coined in its modern definition. Now, in industry costumings, fursuit was just used for any hairy costume, but fursuit as a specific furry outfit, mascot style outfit, was first coined by Robert King, and this is actually one of his outfits. He's actually cosplaying as a skunk character created by Ken Sample. Ken Sample is the individual who created the mascot for the East Coast branch of the Cartoon Fantasy organization. He created a character, original species called the Philinsect. So a Philinsect was separate from the Skiltair. So you can see, of course, the furry fandom was creating original species, which is a big part of the furry fandom. Even to this day, we have creatures like Nova Beasts, Prelogens, Wicker Beasts, and whatnot being a big part of the fan community. Ken Sample is also believed to be the guy who created the concept of the fursona and the fursona badge as well, but it was Robert King who was the one who coined the term fursuit. This leads us to the next major movement in the convention scene, and this is the Fursuit Parade. So, like I said with my previous panel, if you went to my previous history panels, every time a new con branches off of the science, because all these cons, the Comic Cons, the anime cons, the pony conventions, the Star Trek conventions, all came from the science fiction cons. So most of these cons came from a specific motto that they kept. Some cons excised parts of the science fiction motto, some cons kept them. Furry cons, when they branch off of science fiction cons, were one of the few cons that kept almost every single staple of the science fiction cons. So science fiction cons are known for the art show, the hospitality room, the hospitality suite, and the party floor. These are things that furries kept from the science fiction cons. But most importantly, the furry cons kept the masquerade, which has become the staple of science fiction cons during this period. In fact, the Costume Masquerade is considered the highlight of every single science fiction con. And the Costume Masquerade at a science fiction con was always the big event Saturday evening. When furry cons started to form, they decided to move the Costume Masquerade to Saturday afternoon. However, moving it to Saturday afternoon deprived the dealers who were stuck in the dealer's den from seeing these fursuiters. So as two different stories go, as Sai said when I was chatting with him, he said in 1997, Mepet Fur Meet, after the masquerade was done, to give dealers a chance to see these costumers, they decided to march all the fursuiters through the dealer's den, thus starting the tradition of the Fursuit Parade. However, the story that's stated on FurWiki also says it started the same year, 1997, when Yappy Sly Fox at Albany Anthrocon, one of the predecessors to this Anthrocon, decided to do the same thing and march the fursuiters from the masquerade through the dealers, then starting the Fursuit Parade. So both of these are claims as the origins for the first Fursuit Parade. Both of them took place the same year. Both these cons were within a month of each other, so they could have both happened together. But Yappy is most often considered the founder of the Fursuit Parade, specifically with how influential Anthrocon was during this period and still is. And he is seen here at Anthrocon in 1996, leading the Fursuit Parade, which is very symbolic, as he is considered one of the individuals who started the Fursuit Parade. So we could see how from these early costume masquerades eventually led to the formation of the Fursuit Parade. In fact, most furry cons have now gotten rid of the masquerade. In fact, most furry cons no longer have a masquerade, but they still have a Fursuit Parade. So you can kind of see the interesting evolution of that. Now, this leads us into an interesting thing, because this is Sai was also a queer individual who founded the furry fandom as a safe place for queer adults. However, this was during a period when a lot of people wanted to make furry fandom more accessible to the public, quote unquote sanitize and make it family friendly. I want to talk about history, not drama, so I'm just going to sum this up in the most neutral way possible. But especially during the 90s, there was a fight between the furry fandom and a new movement called Anthros who wanted a family-friendly fandom that distanced themselves from kink, and unfortunately that meant at the expense of LGBT queer furries. One of the biggest groups that led the Anthro movement was the Burn Furs. The Burn Furs eventually went away and gave rise to improved anthropomorphic, but you could kind of see the meme here, where this would work just alongside with how the furry fandom has kind of reacted to kink in recent years. So there's so much drama with this, so I don't want to get into much of the details, so I'm just going to look at instances from modern periods. So even though some people use the term anthro as separate from furries, I don't think people choose the term anthro specifically because they want to distance themselves from furries. So, for example, I don't think Anthrocon chooses the term anthros to separate itself from furries. But one con that specifically did try to not use the word furry was Anthro Northwest. They specifically stated they were in an anthropomorphic convention to separate themselves from what they call the furry fandom. And this probably makes sense because Anthro Northwest was founded in Seattle in the ruins of Rainforest, and for a con to kind of furry con to form in Seattle with the legacy of Rainforest, they had to distance themselves from the furry fandom as much as possible. Even more conservative leaning furry cons like Anthro Northwest has really strict restrictions on costuming. Even for the longest time, you couldn't even wear a collar at Anthro Northwest since that was considered adult. Even to this day, Anthro Northwest does not allow scary outfits. So no scary outfits or outfits with spikes are allowed. Another con that went through a lot of controversy in the last few years was Anthro New England. Anthro New England, one of the founders of Anthro New England, and I believe they were con chair or at least on the board, called out plush suits, which were also known as quad suits. And this is actually the term I didn't even know. My friend who who was the con chair of the last BronyCon, didn't even know this term existed, and basically, honestly, it's information I could live without. But there was controversy that these types of suits could have created a fire hazard. So these suits were initially banned from Anthro New England, which would have also excluded this derpy Applejack-looking fursuit right here. Since we're at Anthrocon, most recently was the no poodling rule, which caused a lot of controversy on furry Twitter. So the poodling in the furry fandom is wearing your fursuit head, but showing skin on the arms. So basically a version of partialing where you show skin. Now, this caused some controversy, but it also makes sense. Anthrocon is currently the largest furry con, and it has a very large parade. And that parade is in the middle of summer where it's very hot, and a lot of people want to be in the parade. So Anthrocon had to try to find a way to cut down on how many fursuiters could participate in the parade. But unfortunately, a lot of attendees reacted differently and thought they were trying to exclude people who couldn't afford a full fursuit, and also people who might not be able to fursuit in a hot full fursuit. So that also led to some controversy, but apparently, of course, we just had the Anthrocon parade and it seemed to have gone off without the hitch, so of course there was some controversy behind it, but you know, Anthrocon has happened and everything seems fine right now. So even to this day, there's still a lot of debates with
fursuiting, and this also leads into issues because full fursuits are very, very hot and very, very heavy. So the idea that cons need to have more fursuit lounges become very, very important. Like I said, the fursuit lounge came from Morojo's cosplay lounge. So furries kept that tradition. I think they innovated it with fursuit headless lounges having fans and water inside. However, unfortunately, a lot of cons, because fursuit headless lounges take up a lot of space, are cramming them away, moving them to odd locations. So I know there was a big complaint with FWA this year, where the fursuit, there normally is a headless lounge on every level, and this year, because they had to make room for the concert, they actually removed the second floor headless lounge, which made it hard for furries to move around.
So going back to the siblings of the furry cons, the anime cons, this is where we start seeing the organization of cosplay contests, which we don't have in the furry fandom really. In fact, I think the closest we have in the furry fandom is the fursuit dance competition. And it's believed the first fursuit dance competition started with Furry Week in Atlanta. However, for cosplay contests, specifically stage cosplay contests, they didn't really have standardized rules until Worldcon in 1981, also known as Dimension 2, were the first standardized rules for judging a costume. Based on a 3-tier skill system was formed. So expert, amateur, newbie, yada yada. That following towards the end of the decade, that's when the International Costumers Guild eventually formed the guidelines for fur costume competition, and that has become the standard for every single cosplay contest around the world. The first international cosplay contest, as cited by one academic, was the International Yamato Cup in Brazil in 2001. This was cited in an academic article. Unfortunately, I can't find anything online about it. I can't find any pictures and anything aside from her article. So I'm not sure what this information is, but I'm including this because this was in an academic article. However, it was regarded as really the first international cosplay contest, whereas the World Cosplay Summit started by Japanese cosplayers who invited cosplayers from Germany, France, and Italy. So basically 4 countries for the first international cosplay contest. And this is where we start seeing the shift in cosplay as a hobby, especially when we get the publication of the Genki Layers, which was really the first major cosplay magazine and had big influence on cosplay, not just in Japan, but around the world. One of these major influences included the rise of Lolita fashion in cosplay, which also influenced a lot of cosplay in the United States. This is also the rise of the early internet, especially during the early 2000s, where we start getting a lot of cosplay websites like cosplay.com, where now fans could start organizing and learning how to make different costumes. This is also where we start getting pop culture and media noticing cosplays, with one of the first reality shows, Heroes of Cosplay, airing at this time. As cosplay improved, it went from whatever you could grab, so cheap foam from the hardware store. So a lot of cosplay was made from bath mats and cheap stuff from the hardware store, to eventually we start to get the rise of materials specifically made for cosplayer. This is where we get cosplay specific foam. This was also a period where a lot of contact lenses were made for cosplayers. This is a period where cosplayers can now buy cosplays from Alibaba and different websites like this. Cosplay culture started to become really, really big, specifically at conventions like San Diego Comic-Con and Dragon Con. This is the Atlanta Marriott, where FWA is held. This is their famous carpet, and these are cosplayers who use the pattern from the carpet, who have actually got sued by the owners of the carpet, apparently. Fortunately, this carpet has been removed. That's why you don't see it at FWA anymore. But one of the more interesting thing is, this is where we finally get the rise of a new type of guest of honor. the cosplay guest of honor, specifically at anime cons.
And then also in Japan, you start seeing their own separate evolution for fursuits, where you have the kimono style fursuits, mainly with these big anime style eyes that are covered by glass or plastic, emerging in Japan with big padded legs as well. So you start seeing a new type of cosplay emerging out of Japan. Of course, there's a lot of controversy outside of the furry cons as well. So Nazi cosplay, Hetalia cosplay started making its way into anime cons, which caused a lot of issues. There was a lot of harassment for female cosplayers, which is very unfortunate. And a modern interpretation of the peanut butter clogging the drains at Worldcon is you have the Homestuck Sharpie bath incident at Anime Expo, where someone ended up trying to dye their skin gray by being in a bath of alcohol and Sharpies, and that completely stained the hotel. So this is a modern version of the turd outfit. But despite all the drama, you still have a lot of cosplayers making their way, being represented at a lot of these conventions, where, especially in the Brony fandom, you have a large range of female cosplayers and even young cosplayers being represented at these conventions as well. The Bronies also make their own variations of fursuits, so you start seeing a lot of Brony fursuiters as well, which is also interesting because Everfree Northwest, which is currently the largest BronyCon, is held in the same hotel that Rainforest was kicked out of. And now that hotel has a rule where fursuits are banned, but because Everfree was grandfathered in, the Bronies were technically the last fursuiters allowed at that hotel, even years after they started the no fursuit to this day. Unfortunately, the Bronies and furries still have fightings between each other, and so even at BronyCons, there's hate towards fursuits as well, which is odd because fursuits are welcomed at pony conventions, but then there are dumb people trying to start fights, basically saying no furries or fursuits allowed at our con, which is just really, really dumb. But especially with the furry scene, you had a question?
What exactly caused the ban on the fursuits?
This is there's a con in Orlando where I live now called Mare Fair. It is the Anthrocon Northwest of BronyCons. I don't want to get into the drama because it's really, really weird. But they basically are saying we want a space without fursuiters, which is really, really dumb. But the Brony so I don't want to use this con to judge Bronies because most of the Brony fandom, 99% of Brony fandom does not like this convention, and they've actually been in a campaign to call the hotel to make sure that this con is not welcome back because of the Brony fandom, making sure this con isn't welcome in their fandom, and because of that, I don't think they're going to be back. But yeah, they were the ones who had the stupid "Animal Man Go Home" sticker that was passed around at this year's con. But yeah, going back to the nicer stuff. So now that the tide has changed and furries are now kind of welcomed back by the general public, fursuiters have become like kind of the ambassadors for the furry fandom at these different conventions, to the point where cities like Pittsburgh now have fursuit parades and furries are now welcome. I actually fursuit as my Bash the Pinata fursuit at San Diego Comic-Con and Worldcon. In fact, I was actually at the Worldcon Masquerade this year in Seattle. If we had the audio set up, I would play it, but I think I might be one of the first fursuiters at a Worldcon Masquerade, the oldest masquerade in the world, and I only joined last minute because someone saw my fursuit and was like, hey, you should do the masquerade, it's in 12 hours. But the masquerade, like I said, the science fiction masquerade, you had to perform a 1-minute skit. And once I found out it was the 85th anniversary of the first Worldcon Masquerade, I was like, oh, I had to do something. So I put together a 1-minute medley of folk music over the last 85 years, and basically in 1 minute dance to all these different folk and fan songs in my fursuit. And actually it's funny because I actually included Brony and furry music, so I included Eurobeat and Living Tombstone songs, as well as Pepper and other furry musicians. And someone actually mentioned this might be the first time that Brony and furry music has officially played on the Worldcon Masquerade stage, which I think is actually kind of funny, since that is the oldest masquerade in the world. So yes, furries are now kind of more honored and represented at different cons across the country.
So fursuiting at a non-furry con is nice because it shows furry representation at these comic and anime conventions. A lot of cons now have fursuit parades that also go through the downtown area. The Anthrocon parade is most famous with this, where the relationship between the city of Pittsburgh and Anthrocon is at an all-time high through to positivity with the fursuit parade. A lot of locals will come out specifically just to see the Anthrocon parade. And of course, furries are one of the most generous of the convention types, where the furries would raise a lot of money for their charity auctions, especially with cosplayers and fursuiters being heavily represented. So even with all the craziness that has happened lately, fursuiters still have at least a positive mark on the public. Despite the rules of pooling and stuff, it does sound like that the Anthrocon Fursuit Parade still was a big success. And right now, I believe the block party is still happening. So you have a chance, make sure to still check out the Anthrocon block party. And I think that actually concludes my panel. So thank you all for coming to my panel. Contact me at conhistory@gmail.com. Thank you.